And it's recording. Since this is your final lecture this term, we will try to do something differently today. Instead of continuing our survey into 20th century architecture, we will be looking back at 1,000 years of architectural history. So, in a way, we'll try to summarize your 2 years study into architectural history. But it will be a summary with a specific slant, a specific twist. And that twist is the professional and educational situation of architects throughout the ages, which incidentally is my personal research interest. In other words, this will be a history of architects rather than architecture. Who built the buildings we have encountered over the past 2 years, and how did they become architects? How did they acquire the skills and knowledge they needed to create buildings? So this is what we're trying to answer today. We will also try to figure out how you have ended up in your particular situation. What are the roots for the particular course of education you have embarked on and will hopefully bring to a successful conclusions a few years down the line? Why did you have to come to a university to study architecture? Why do you have to interrupt your course halfway through and then at the end again to gain practical experience? We take such things for granted today, but they are the outcome of very specific historical developments and circumstances, and after today's lecture you will know what these are. We will start our discussion in the late Middle Ages, the Gothic period. In the Middle Ages, access to knowledge was controlled by the Church, and from the 12th century onward, increasingly delivered through universities. Some of these universities evolved from pre-existing monastic schools, so where monks taught. Others were entirely new foundations, usually by the urban nobility, but in some cases by the students themselves, as was indeed the case for the very first European university, which was the one at Bologna, founded in 1088. Universities extended the religion-focused education of monastic schools and included subjects which were thought to be more relevant to the rising civic societies in the late Middle Ages, particularly law. Architecture and building were not subjects that were taught at universities, and neither were things like statics or geometry, knowledge of which was of course absolutely vital if you wanted to create major Gothic buildings such as this one here, which is St. Vitus Cathedral in Prague. These subjects, architecture, building, geometry, etc., were seen and dismissed as purely manual skills which had to be acquired through practice. Aspiring craftsmen learned from their masters. You can see some of them here on this print out of the Morgan Bible, mid-13th century. Craftsmen learned from their masters, and in the case of the great cathedrals, both training and practice took place in so-called building lodges. Now, a building lodge the term building lodge denotes two different things. On the one hand, it is the actual physical structure, so a workshop or a shed on the construction site of a cathedral. And in a second sense, building lodge was the organization that was set up to build a Gothic cathedral. So in a way, a general contractor which guaranteed prices, hired personnel, etc., and was a sort of safety net for the church, which built and financed the cathedral, bearing in mind that building a Gothic cathedral was a high-risk enterprise, not just in constructional terms, but also financially. They usually built as high and as daringly as they could, and every now and then one of these structures collapsed. That was a technical constructional problem, but it was also a financial problem, because obviously it incurred a lot of costs. The overall responsibility for major building projects, notably cathedrals, was shared between two main figures. You can see these two main figures here on this slide. On the left-hand side, that's the Rector Fabricae, the building director. He was, in a sense, the client's representative on the building side, so the church's representative. And he was in charge of financing, accounting, hiring staff, but also acquisition and delivery of building materials, bearing in mind that the church and nobility owned all the quarries, brickworks, forests for timber, etc. at the time. The second figure on the right-hand side was the Magister Operis, the Master of Works. In the early Middle Ages, these were usually monks. Later on, in the Gothic period, late Middle Ages, when the church became wealthier and craftsmen became better organized through their guilds, these were usually highly trained, highly qualified master masons. Now, the Master of Works, the second figure on that earlier slide, had the technical and artistic responsibility for the building. In other words, he was the architect. He was assisted by a number of specialist craftsmen. You can see a few of them on this slide. But it was his vision which drove the creation of the cathedral, and he often designed not just the overall layout, but also specific structural details. All other craftsmen, such as these ones here, were on fixed contract, usually daily contract. But the master mason had a 5-year contract, and if the building wasn't finished by then, his contract was often extended to a lifelong contract, and that obviously happened relatively often because Gothic cathedrals were not usually built within 5 years. The Master of Works developed his designs on site, and he conveyed his instructions either orally, by explaining them, or through practical demonstration. Though they did use a number of auxiliary devices as well. These included life-size sketch models of particularly fiddly details, as well as so-called tracing floors, such as the one here, where the master mason would draw elevations and floor plans into a plaster floor inside the church, and his craftsmen then used this as a template. This is a particularly well-preserved tracing floor in Bourges Cathedral. In Britain, we have 2 such floors remaining, not to this quality. One is at Wells Cathedral, and the other one is at York Cathedral. In addition, medieval masons also used plan drawings, though not to an extent as we use them today. Plans were usually elevations or floor plans. Sections existed, but were comparatively rare, and obviously perspective drawing hadn't been invented yet, so they didn't exist. Drawings were generally to scale, though of course the imperial and metric systems hadn't been invented yet either, so measuring systems varied from city to city. Relatively common was a scale of 1:36, which often resulted in very large plans. This elevation here of Cologne Cathedral measures more than 4 meters in height and is drawn, as you can see here on the left-hand side, in considerable detail. Drawings, such as the ones I just showed you, they were done by the master mason who stood at the top of the creative hierarchy. He was the architect. So, as an aspiring master of works, how did you get there? Well, it was a long and, in the late Middle Ages, surprisingly regulated procession through various training stages. Generally, you would start your working age, your working life at the age of 14, and would become an apprentice on a building site. Such an apprenticeship usually lasted 4 or 5 years. Once you were finished with that apprenticeship, you had to do another apprenticeship, this time as a bricklayer, which lasted another 3 years. To guarantee the quality of your training, there were only 2 or 3 apprentices allowed per building site, and they were all supervised directly by the Master of Works. So once you'd done your 2 apprenticeships, you went on a journey, you went to travel, often quite far away. The point of, you were now a journeyman. That's where the term journeyman comes from. No women at the time, I'm afraid. Journeymen who had a higher status to apprentices. Now, the purpose of your travels was to expand your knowledge and acquire new skills by working for different masters. This usually lasted about a year, and once you came back, you were finally ready to be a qualified mason, but not yet an architect. If you wanted to become a Master of Works, an architect, you had to complete an additional course of training, basically further education, which took you an additional 2 years. Your new job title was now artistic servant or master servant. And it was in these 2 years where you acquired all the design skills and the technical skills which would enable you to eventually design and build your own cathedral. Even now, though, your training was entirely practice-based. There are a number of reasons why there were no textbooks or design manuals or things like that at the time. The most obvious reason is, of course, book printing hadn't been invented yet, so it was relatively difficult to copy and disseminate written material. In connection with this, a second equally obvious reason, because book printing hadn't been invented yet, and reading wasn't common, most craftsmen were illiterate, so a textbook would have been no good to them. The third, less obvious, but even more important reason was that building lodges guarded their design and technical skills as trade secrets and passed them down from generation to generation within their lodge. They did retain their plans for legal reasons, and some master masons had their personal books with plan drawings showing particularly successful detail solutions which they produced, but they would never have shared these books with anyone outside their building lodge. After 2 years perfecting your craft as a master servant or artistic servant, you were finally ready to complete your training and become a Master of Works, an architect. To do so, you needed references from 2 respected masters, and in some regions you also had to sit for a theoretical exam before the masters of the local guild, though evidence for practical abilities remained the more important. So to summarize then, the late medieval architect was a craftsman, and he remained a craftsman throughout his professional life. Architectural education, the rise from apprentice to Master of Works, took at least 11 years and usually considerably longer than that. So if you think your training is agonizingly long, it is, but it could be worse. The effort was worth it, though, because Masters of Works acquired enormously high social standing and often considerable wealth. The slide here shows Peter Parler, who was something of a star architect in his period. He came from southern Germany, and he designed and built churches and cathedrals both in Germany, in Austria, in Switzerland, presumably in Italy, we're not quite sure, and in the Czech Republic as well, including St. Vitus Cathedral, which you can see here pictured again. When Parler was in charge of building St. Vitus Cathedral, for instance, he had a regular income which was paid out even when weather or other disruptions prevented the building from continuing, he was paid an additional salary for every day he actually showed up for work. He was given free accommodation, free clothing, money for heating timber in winter, and in addition, because he was a master of works, he had income from several other building sites. Master masons like Peter Parler were incredibly prominent and wealthy, but they were still craftsmen. And this changed with the Renaissance. In the early 15th century, the late Middle Ages, Gothic period, gave way to humanism and the Renaissance. This involved profound social and cultural changes, one of which was the importance that was attached to education. And this affected the position of artists and of architects very profoundly. Medieval artists had worked for the greater glory of God. Okay? The more they did to praise God, the higher their renown. And this is the reason why master of works such as Peter Parler were so prominent, because, you know, building a cathedral in God's honor is relatively hard to top devotion-wise. In the Renaissance, such considerations became slightly less relevant. Artists attained status through their education and intellectual faculties. In fact, in the Renaissance, the term art was an umbrella term encompassing anything that involved the cultivation of intellectual skill, including science. Basically, in the Renaissance, power had three pillars. There was the divine power of God and his earthly representatives, the church. Then there was the political power of the monarch. And the third power was art, which was the technical and intellectual power of educated people. At the heart of all this was this idea of the uomo universale, this master of all trades ideal of Renaissance artists, man as the measure of all things, as epitomized by Leonardo da Vinci's famous drawing of the Vitruvian Man. Today we are impressed by the sheer variety and scope of activities in which people like Leonardo da Vinci or Leon Battista Alberti engaged. Alberti was a horseman, he was a playwright, he was a composer, he was an architect. Incidentally, he also had a doctorate in law from the University of Bologna, which I mentioned earlier. Yet Alberti himself would have seen no distinction between all these activities. To him and to other Renaissance artists, this was all part of the same vocation, that of being an artist. So there was no distinction between art and science in the Renaissance. But there was very much a distinction between liberal arts and applied arts. Liberal arts included purely intellectual disciplines, such as mathematics, literature, history, law, medicine, whereas the applied arts encompassed anything that involved any manual labor, labor which was carried out by people of considerably lower standing, craftsmen, workers, or indeed slaves. Painters, sculptors, and architects were somehow caught in the middle because obviously what they did involved both manual and intellectual skills. The 15th century was all about their attempt to raise their own profession to the status of liberal art. To achieve this, they consciously disassociated themselves from craftsmen and sought closer relation with the other liberal arts. And this is one of the main reasons why systems of proportion, systems of harmony became so important during the Renaissance, because by basing their designs on clear mathematical rules, they could demonstrate that what they did was in fact a liberal art and not a manual skill. This also explains why the invention of linear perspective was such a watershed moment in the Renaissance, and why it became such a conspicuous feature in Renaissance art. Perspective composition served a clear and vital purpose for artists. No longer were they naively imitating nature. They were able to reconstruct it, reproduce it, based on rigid mathematical rules. So again, they linked their own activities to the intellectual skills of mathematicians, mathematicians being the most renowned of the liberal artists, because their activity clearly didn't involve any manual skill at all. You can see on the slide the relevant page in Sebastiano Serlio's famous treatise on architectural theory. That's in the mid-16th century. Linear perspective itself was invented about 100 years prior by Brunelleschi. In the end, their strategy proved successful. Painting, sculpture, and architecture, you can see the trinity of the arts here, so the painter, the architect, and the sculpture over there, were recognized as liberal arts and seen as intrinsically linked with each other, a trinity of arts whose common basis was the drawing, gli arti di disegno, as the Italians called it, the arts of drawing. Incidentally, this also marks the birth of the artwork as an object whose existence is justified purely on the basis of its beauty, as opposed to a utility object whose existence obviously is justified through its purpose. Against this backdrop, it should be clear that the training of Renaissance architects differed profoundly from that in previous years. In sharp contrast to the Middle Ages, a craft background was exceptionally rare for Renaissance architects. Of the high Renaissance architects in Rome, only Antonio da Zangallo had a crafts background. He was a carpenter, and it took him up until the age of 32 to finally make that step into architecture and lose his stigma as a craftsman. A second, slightly, this, by the way, is his most famous building up there, which I presume you know, Palazzo Farnese in Rome. A second, slightly later example was Andrea Palladio, who'd initially trained as a stonemason and owed his architectural career to the support from some highly distinguished humanist scholars who spotted his unique design and nurtured his talents. Daniele Barbaro, who commissioned this villa here from Palladio, was one of Palladio's mentors. As I said, though, these two were very rare exceptions. The vast majority of Renaissance architects trained as apprentices to sculptors or painters, and therefore thereby became sculptors or painters themselves, such training lasting usually about a decade. You can see Tintoretto's studio here with some of his apprentices. Artists became architects when one of their patrons asked them to take on the design of a building, and this only happened after they'd distinguished themselves as artists, and therefore usually relatively late in their lives. Architects had high social status in the Renaissance, not because they designed buildings, but because to be allowed to design buildings, they first had to be artists of the highest order. So in the Renaissance then, we end up with a vision of the architect that differed from the Middle Ages. The Gothic architect had been a craftsman working in a workshop on the building site. Any artistic achievement grew organically from his supreme mastery of his craft. The Renaissance architect was an artist who developed the design of a building in the form of drawings and left the solution of structural and technical matters to his masons or carpenters. He had no knowledge of structural matters, and he didn't have the slightest interest in them. He worked in his private studio and avoided any contact with the building process because it was precisely his detachment from the building process which secured his high social standing. Towards the late Renaissance, Italian artists and architects began to organize themselves into academies. And 100 years later, this academy system became the basis of the French academic system, which was the first formalized and institutionalized system of architectural education in the world, and one of the main drivers behind neoclassic architecture in the 18th and 19th centuries. And the slide shows a very early example, Claude Perrault's east front of the Louvre. We will ignore the early French academies today and focus instead on the culminating achievement of the French academic system, which is the École des Beaux-Arts, which was founded in Paris in 1819. The Beaux-Arts was controlled by a powerful figure called Antoine Chrysostome Quatremère de Quincy. Bit of a mouthful, that one. And he was at the same time in charge of the commission which advised the French king on public building projects in France. In other words, Quatremère not only controlled the education of architects, he also controlled the granting of official commissions, and he made sure that the two were intrinsically linked. For the next 150 years, only Beaux-Arts alumni would be allowed to build anything of any size or substance for the French state. Quatremère promoted the rigid doctrines of French neoclassicism with dictatorial fervor. And he was a passionate believer in this Renaissance trinity of the arts. The Beaux-Arts school had its own faculty and curriculum, but it was governed by the Beaux-Arts Academy. And in the Beaux-Arts Academy, architect members were outnumbered by painters and sculptors. This had a profound impact on the approach of the school insofar as in the Renaissance, architecture was seen as a problem of drawing and design, committed to this supreme importance of the drawing and judged solely on its artistic merit, so structure didn't play any role at all. I could easily fill an entire lecture on the Beaux-Arts, but since we have only 2 hours to cover 1,000 years of architectural education, let's just focus on the two most important features of the Beaux-Arts system. The first of these features was the studio system. Students received their training in the studios of their masters, the so-called ateliers, and they used the academy only for complementary facilities, lecture courses, library, etc. The Beaux-Arts was divided into 10 to 20 of these teaching ateliers, all of them in effect independent schools of architecture, and kept separate from the patron's actual office where he worked on his commissions with his employees. The patron himself came in 2 or 3 times a week to check on students' work. But the studio itself was governed by the students themselves. All the students gave informal criticism and tuition to younger students, and younger students in turn helped with presentation drawings and the like. The students elected one of their group to administrate the office, collect modest dues from all its members, pay all the running bills, including the fees for the patron whose name the atelier carried, in this case here, Jean-Louis Pascal. The interesting thing is that the Beaux-Arts school itself did not charge any fees. It was free even for foreigners. Students popped in if and when they liked, or not at all. They had to pass exams in some theoretical subjects, but the lectures themselves were not mandatory, and they were accordingly poorly attended. Students saw themselves as pupils of their master, not of the school, because it was in his studio where they learned to become architects, through drawing and drawing alone. The second distinctive feature of the Beaux-Arts system was its competitive nature. The entire course was geared to one major annual event, which was the competition for the Prix de Rome, the Rome Prize, a fully funded scholarship which enabled its winner to spend 3 to 5 years in Rome studying classical architecture firsthand. Each year, up to 500 people apply to the school, and of those who passed the entrance examination, which itself took about 2 years to prepare for, 60 were picked and put in what was called the second class. Students' progress was assessed through a system of competitions. The majority of these were on architectural composition, and they alternated between so-called esquisses en loge and projets rendus. Esquisses en loge, you can see 2 examples here on this slide, were sketch designs. The student was isolated in a small cubicle, and he was given 12 hours to study the program and come up with a design solution which he had to record on one sheet of paper. So, relatively large sheet of paper. This is the outcome of 12 hours work in complete isolation. And this esquisse en loge had to record the basic concept of his design in quite some detail. Projets rendus were rendered projects, usually for a small building, such as a college or a railway station, and consisting of 3 fully rendered, fully elaborated drawings, which were handed in after 2 months. These 2 started with an esquisse en loge, from which the participant was not allowed to digress. The jury, in the end, compared each projet rendu with the initial sketch, and if they didn't reflect exactly the same idea, the participant was disqualified, which happened fairly frequently. The reason for this complicated arrangement is since students did all their work in their studio, there was no way for the school to know who prepared what. So that's why students were isolated for 12 hours at the start of every project and had to completely fix themselves on a particular design idea and on a particular compositional idea. And if they didn't stick with it, it was assumed that they didn't produce their own work and they were failed. As I said, happened fairly frequently. To be admitted to the first class, the student had to get a certain number of credits in these competitions. So the better your project was, the more credit you received, as well as a number of separate competitions on mathematics, perspective drawing, and construction. Generally, it took students 2 to 4 years to get promoted to first class. Once there, in the first class, the curriculum was more or less the same, but the programs became more complicated and complex, museums, hotels, etc., to prepare the most able students for the competition for the Rome Prize, which was the one that really mattered in the Beaux-Arts system. Now, the competition for the Prix de Rome lasted almost half a year and consisted of 3 stages. The first stage, which was open to all French citizens, so not just members of the school, anyone was allowed to participate, any French person, no foreigners. And it consisted of a 12-hour esquisse en loge, 12-hour sketch design. Out of all the participants, the jury picked 30, the 30 best sketch designs, and only these 30 sketch designs, or the authors of these 30 sketch designs, were allowed to enter the second trial. The second trial was a 24-hour esquisse en loge, usually for a very complicated planning program. Out of these 30 submissions, the jury picked 8 winners, and only these 8 winners were allowed to progress into the third trial, which was the actual competition for the Rome Prize. So incredibly sort of structured, complicated process. The competition program for the Prix de Rome, again, was a highly complicated planning problem, big building, big monumental building, trade school or a large national museum and stuff like that. And it again started with an esquisse en loge, and the students then had 4 months to prepare their final drawings. And when they did that, when one member of a studio qualified for participation in the third trial of the Rome Prize, his entire studio, his entire atelier, effectively became a team of assistants. They all worked for him. This one here is a winning scheme of 1824 by Henri Lapouste. Please notice how similar the final presentation drawings are to his initial esquisse. If they weren't similar, he couldn't have won. The winner of the Rome Prize was seen as the most promising architect of the year. And when he, never a she as far as I know, returned from his stint in Rome, 3, 4, 5, 6 year stint in Rome, he was destined for a distinguished career building monuments for the French government. Now, the fascinating thing about the Beaux-Arts system is, with its distinct hierarchy, each year only one student actually completed the course, and that was the winner of the Rome Prize. The vast majority of students never came anywhere near winning this prize, and they simply dropped, well, they stayed as long as they thought they could benefit from the school, and when they thought they'd learned enough, they simply dropped out. Up until the late 19th century, there was no certificate or diploma at the École des Beaux-Arts. So the Beaux-Arts system was absolutely merciless in its elitism. Only one student each year mattered, and that student was the one who won the Prix de Rome. A second important system of formalized architectural education is the German Polytechnic model, whose origins, incidentally, were also in France. The École Polytechnique in Paris, which was founded in 1795, I believe, was to some extent a parallel institution to the École des Beaux-Arts, but it was aimed at engineers rather than architects. Effectively, it offered a preparatory training for all building professionals before they progressed to other more specialized schools to complete their training. This preparatory training included a course of architecture. Stylistically, it was as committed to neoclassical ideals as the Beaux-Arts, but the teaching approach was entirely different. The Beaux-Arts promoted a sort of idealized classicism. It was the educational arm of an academy which sought to define universal rules in architecture and therefore lift architecture to a state of perfection, basically. The École Polytechnique had no such ambitions. Its objective was to teach architecture to engineers who had no time and presumably no interest in sort of figuring out all the subtleties of academic classicism. Jean-Nicolas Louis Durand, who devised the course at the École Polytechnique, realized that the plans and elevations of neoclassical buildings could easily be reduced to a regular grid. This grid, in turn, could be interpreted as a structural grid. And this meant that the composition of buildings produced by École Polytechnique students, the composition derived from structure rather than the other way around, as was the case in the École des Beaux-Arts. You can see this rather nicely here. This is one page out of Durand's textbook for his students. This page here shows a variety of solutions for vestibules which could be attached to palaces, all of them, as you can see, based on a strict regular grid. So effectively, the École Polytechnique promoted a dry, technological vision of architecture, as opposed to the sort of high-flying artistic intentions of the Beaux-Arts. This polytechnic approach proved highly appealing to authorities in the German-speaking countries. And to understand why, we need to look at the specific situation of architects in these countries. Unlike in France, where architects had their own school and recognized professional standing, in Germany, architects were still sort of in that Renaissance mode of basically being artists who also happened to design buildings as well. They had no status and no recognition as professionals in their own right. Now, in the early 19th century, when wealth creation and the rise of civic societies multiplied the types and number of buildings which had to be provided by the state for its citizens, town halls, hospitals, prisons, etc., the lack of a properly defined and trained architectural profession became a serious problem. Unlike in France, where public building projects were carried out by a relatively small number of highly distinguished, hand-picked architects, usually winners of the Rome Prize. In Germany, we witnessed, not just in architecture, the rise of a comprehensive civil service which was set up to satisfy the demands of the public sector. Now, the purpose of the new German polytechnics, you can see two of the earliest ones here, Karlsruhe and Dresden. The purpose of these German polytechnics was to provide the civil service with a sufficient number of capable architects. So in sharp contrast to the Beaux-Arts, the objective of the polytechnics was technical expertise, a good average standard of a large number of architects, rather than artistic distinction of a very small few. In spite, or because of this, the polytechnic model has proved an incredibly successful model in architectural education, historically perhaps the most successful one. Today, out of the top 4 architecture schools in the world, 3 have a polytechnic background. The reason for the success of the polytechnic model was the fact that the polytechnics, as breeding grounds for the civil service, were soon lifted to the state of technical universities or institutes of technology, to use modern terminology. And they became incredibly powerful institutions themselves. The classic example is ETH Zurich, which you can see here, which even today has a considerably higher academic standard than all universities in the country. This one here is the main building of ETH Zurich, designed by its first professor, Gottfried Semper, German architect. The transformation of polytechnics into technical universities also meant that technical education soaked up some of the specific German university traditions. The most important of these was their research emphasis. Now, in Britain and in France, universities were traditionally pure teaching institutions, with research being the private preoccupation of scholars. In Germany, universities were research institutions. So when architectural education became part of this university context, it also became part of this research emphasis. For the time being, this remained of little significance, but if you think about architecture schools today, especially here in Britain, schools that are part of Russell Group universities such as ours, research is an incredibly important aspect of architectural education, as important as teaching. The third model of formalized architectural education, which emerged in the 18th and 19th centuries, was the British system of pupillage. The image shows the Bank of England by John Soane. I'll come back to in a moment. The situation in Britain differed, and still differs, profoundly from that on the continent. In France and Germany, we witnessed a system where the state defines and regulates the architectural profession by certifying its members. In Britain, the situation is completely different. Here, architectural training, or professional training quite generally, is entirely controlled by the professions themselves. Remember that even today, both the RIBA and the ARB are independent private organizations. The state provides the legal framework through Parliament, but within this framework, they are relatively free to operate as they wish. Now let's take a look how this situation came about. Between the early 17th and mid-18th century, there were 5 different ways through which people could enter the architectural profession. And therefore, there were 5 different categories of architect. The first of these categories was the artist architect, in a sort of Renaissance tradition. The classic example is Inigo Jones, who built a number of beautiful sort of Neo-Palladian buildings, such as Banqueting House. Inigo Jones was originally an artist and a designer for the theatre, who then became an architect later on. The second category was the scientist architect. The classic example here is, of course, Christopher Wren, who built St. Paul's Cathedral. Christopher Wren had no background in the arts whatsoever, but he was a prolific scientist and inventor. This one here is a drawing of a brain which he did for a scientific publication of one of his colleagues. The third category was the so-called gentleman architect. He or she was a member of the nobility with plenty of disposable cash and a broad enough education to take up any pastime they fancied, including architecture. The classic example here is Burlington, who built himself a number of buildings, most notably Chiswick House in London, which is modelled on the Villa Rotonda by Palladio. The fourth category of architect was the craftsman architect. This was essentially the sort of medieval model whereby builders, carpenters, craftsmen, etc. took charge of the design as well as the construction of buildings. In the 17th century, almost all ordinary buildings in Britain were built by craftsmen architects. A particularly interesting institution in this context was the Royal Works, which realized major building projects on behalf of the state. From 1669, Christopher Wren, whom we just saw earlier, headed the Royal Works and recognized its potential as a training facility. Wren realized that by giving apprentices stints in different departments of the Royal Works, he could develop them as fully trained architects. So essentially a similar model to the medieval building lodge. The best-known architect who was trained in such a fashion was Nicholas Hawksmoor, who obviously built Westminster Abbey along with a number of other London churches. Hawksmoor was the son of a farmer and a clerk to a plaster before, at the age of 18, he became the personal assistant of Christopher Wren at the Royal Works. He worked at the Royal Works in different functions as an apprentice for 15 years. And when, at the age of 32, he finally started to design and build his own buildings, there was very little he didn't know about the building process. Now, Christopher Wren headed the Royal Works for about 50 years, but once he left, the Royal Works declined in influence, and the fifth and final category of architect became the dominant one in Britain. This category was articled pupillage. Basically what this means was that aspiring architects attached themselves to a practicing master who would give them instruction in site work, drawing techniques, office supervision, etc., in return for a fee. This usually took about 5 or 6 years. Towards the end of the 18th century, pupillage emerged as the dominant way of training as an architect in Britain. By 1789, it accounted for 1/3, and 30 years later for 2/3 of all architectural training in Britain. And all other forms declined rapidly. All the great British neoclassical architects, Soane, Adam, Chambers, Nash, they were all trained through articled pupillage, as was indeed Edwin Lutyens, and in America, Frank Lloyd Wright, who was the pupil of Louis Sullivan. Now, the advantages of the pupillage system are quite obvious. Unlike any school system, the supply of new architects could be regulated according to market demand. So if there were no architects needed, you just wouldn't train them. Secondly, what needed to be learned was defined by practicing architects who, of course, always know best what sort of skills are needed to make a successful living as an architect. In an ideal form, pupillage sort of emulated the versatile model of the Royal Works, but it obviously depended on a well-organized office through whose hierarchy and labor division an aspirant could be developed. Such offices did exist. The most famous example is the office of John Soane, who gave his pupils a thorough tuition in drawing techniques and architectural design, and to encourage them to attend lectures at the Royal Academy, particularly the ones he himself delivered. One interesting teaching method which Soane employed was to send out his apprentices to construction sites to make sketches of work in progress. You can see one of his apprentices here in Dulwich Mausoleum. Now obviously this still didn't give them any practical know-how, but at least it gave them some idea as to how the building process works. Now the problem with pupillage was that the quality of training varied greatly, because unlike in the systems in France and in Germany, there was no common standard for the way different masters trained their pupils. Many architects, like Soane, took the education of their pupils very seriously, but since the system was self-regulating, in other words, not regulated at all, it was often open to abuse. Some so-called architects who never built or designed anything of value in their lives made a lavish living cashing in on premiums and rents without ever teaching their pupils anything, but making them just sketch famous cathedrals or carry out chores around the house. The slide shows an illustration out of Dickens's Martin Chuzzlewit. Martin Chuzzlewit is one of these unlucky articled pupils who worked for an arrogant and totally useless master called Seth Pecksniff. This picture here shows the foundation laying ceremony for a new school, which was designed by Pecksniff, who had in fact stolen a private drawing of his pupil, Martin Chuzzlewit, and pretended it was his own. Now, some pupils were not willing to put up with this sort of thing any longer, and in the 1840s, a small number of them started a rebellion, which by the end of the 19th century would lead to the introduction of full-time school training in the UK. This then brings us to the 20th century, which is sort of the core topic this term. But before we do that, I think we should take a short break, 10 minutes, up until 5:05. Has that register gone through? Right, let's continue. Before the break, I introduced three educational systems which emerged between the 17th and 19th century. The French academic system, the German polytechnic system, and the British system of pupillage. In the second part of our lecture today, we'll see how, we'll focus on Britain and see how this system of pupillage eventually led into this model of full-time school training in a university context. So in other words, your present-day system. There were two main differences between pupillage and the French and German systems. One was the fact that the continental systems played out in a school environment, whereas the British system was office-based. The second difference was that the continental systems were dominated by the state, which shaped the profession to its needs. You passed some examination, and you received some diploma or certificate, and this meant you were now an architect. In the British system, the profession regulated itself through pupillage, without any recognition or protection from the state, and this left the profession inherently vulnerable. It is in this context that we have to see the foundation of the RIBA in 1834. This slide obviously shows the RIBA headquarters, which was built in 1934 to celebrate the centenary of the RIBA. The RIBA was one of several institutions, like the Institute of Civil Engineers and the Royal Institution of Chartered Surveyors, through which individual building professions tried to protect their scope, their activities, their interests. In sharp contrast to the continent, these were and still are private associations. The state plays no part in them, apart from providing the legal framework, in the case of architecture, through the Architects' Registration Acts of 31, 38, and 97, nowadays administered by ARB. The rise of these institutions, including the RIBA, reflected developments which were, at the time, unique to Britain, developments in the building industry. Chief amongst these was the rise of general contractors, large-scale building firms, who took charge of major buildings, supervising individual craftsmen and subcontractors in a similar way in which, in previous ages, architects had done. So, many of these building firms, large contractors, had their own design departments. And there was a clear risk for architects to become redundant, or at the very least, highly insignificant. The slide shows Osborne House on the Isle of Wight, built for Prince Albert and Queen Victoria, by Thomas Cubitt, who owned one of these large building firms. Osborne House was built from designs drawn up in Thomas Cubitt's own design department, so without any independent architect designing or even supervising the whole building. Now, the only part of the building process to which no other profession had a prior or better claim was art, and this was therefore the particular specialism which the RIBA tried to defend on behalf of its members. The stylish facade decorations, which are so common in high Victorian architecture, for instance, Victoria Building that we have here on campus, that really reflect this enormous this sort of eagerness of artistic distinction. This was the only thing that only architects could do. Now, initially, the RIBA focused its efforts on setting binding competition standards. In the absence of state certification, the best chance for young architects to make themselves known was by participating in, and hopefully winning, one of the several countless competitions that were organized in the 19th century. Competitions were a key feature of Victorian architecture. You can see here just the selection: Westminster Palace, the Crystal Palace, St. George's Hall. These were all the outcome of public competitions. Education was initially of lesser significance to the RIBA. The RIBA was controlled by its fellows, fellows were members who were at least 7 years in private practice, and therefore usually in charge of one or more pupils. So these people had a vested interest in article pupillage, and they were not at all inclined to jeopardize a secure source of income. I mentioned some of the downsides of the pupillage system before the break, specifically this lack of regulation which left the system open to abuse. Another drawback was the fact that by passing skills from master to pupil, the system was inherently conservative and restrictive. Aspiring architects, creative young architects who wish to expand their knowledge and sort of develop their own design skills were really hampered by this system. The formation of the Architectural Association in 1847 was a direct response to this state of affairs. The AA was founded by two young men who were in your age group, even younger. One of them was Robert Carr, who was 23 at the time, and the other one, of whom I found no picture, was a man called Charles Gray, who was only 18. They were both articled pupils who felt that what they learned from their masters was far from satisfactory. And they established the AA as a sort of self-help group for articled pupils and assistants, running mutual criticism of private designs as well as private lectures. This was the nucleus of the first British School of Architecture. As the fast-growing AA soon hired instructors for their design classes, having emerged from self-help groups, these design classes, however, remained collegial and informal, in sharp contrast to the setup in France and also in Germany. The sort of informal table discussions which you have with your design tutors, as well as the equally informal end-of-term reviews, they are both inventions of the AA which have spread worldwide. The AA were also the first who came up with the idea of an examination system as the basis for a qualifying diploma for British architects. The RIBA adopted and promoted this idea, and in 1882 it made it mandatory for people to pass the RIBA exams to become associates of the RIBA and therefore architects. Pupillage remained a valid route into the profession and was not fully abandoned for another 60 years. But the RIBA's examination system meant that pupils now had to pass an exam. And therefore, many of them prepared to pass these exams in part-time schools which popped up all over the country. At the same time, the RIBA's new examination system also meant that the possibility of full-time school training came up. And this in turn triggered the interest of universities, though not the old established universities. For instance, Cambridge didn't take architectural education seriously up until the mid-1950s, and Oxford even longer. The red brick universities, however, they were more open-minded and had less problem with a course of study which had a sort of vocational slant. And the first full-time course of architectural education was therefore established at one of these universities, namely at ours, here in 1895, first here in the Victoria Building. 5 years later, Liverpool offered an honours degree, and 2 years later, the RIBA recognized this degree as exempting its students from its own examinations. Now, once full-time school training had been established as a possible route into the profession, disputes arose as to what should be taught and how it should be taught. These disputes were incredibly complex, and there's no time to sort of disentangle the different positions. But broadly speaking, very broadly speaking, there emerged two opposing factions. One faction was the arts and crafts people, They emphasized an approach to architecture which was based on local materials, local craft traditions, etc. And they consequently rejected anything that would strengthen the separation of architects from the other building professions. Unsurprisingly, arts and crafts architects had opposed the foundation of the RIBA, which entrenched divisions between architect and other building professionals. But once the RIBA was a fact of life, they tried their utmost to influence its course. The other faction were the classicists. They hoped to establish a sort of Beaux-Arts type system regulated by the RIBA, focusing on drawing techniques and based on a sort of theoretical body of theoretical knowledge. At first, the arts and crafts faction dominated the scene. The leading figure here was this man here, William Leatherby, who promoted an architecture which was entirely based in construction without any stylistic pretensions. Effectively, Leatherby's vision of the architects was that of a Gothic master mason whose superior understanding of all building crafts would give him his authority over the building process. Leatherby's vision of the ideal architecture school was sort of halfway between the medieval building lot and the German polytechnics. He worked for the London County Council, and he set up two schools in which he in part managed to realize his ideas. The first of these schools was the Central School of Arts and Crafts, which was a combined school for artists and craftsmen established in 1896, I think. This is now Central St. Martin's. The second school was the School of Building at Brixton, which you can see pictured here, which focused more on the building professionals themselves. This is now part of London South Bank University. And basically the idea was to train architects along with all other building professions under one roof through practical demonstrations and sort of building little structures so they could learn their trade. And this was a converted swimming pool in Brixton. Now, around the turn of the century, most of the leading schools, including the AA and Liverpool, went through a distinct arts and crafts period. But this was only a passing fancy. In the Edwardian period, first decade of the 20th century, arts and crafts went out of fashion and gave way to a new classicism whose most famous exponent has popped up repeatedly over the past few weeks, Edwin Lutyens. Now, classicism could not be learned in collaboration with craftsmen, but it required an academic environment. And the first school which reacted to this was the University of Liverpool, which in the first decade of the 20th century became the guiding light in architectural education in Britain. In just 5 years, Liverpool extended its intake of students from 12 to over 200, drawn from all corners of the British Empire and indeed from other countries as well. Today, all British schools of architecture are international in character, but Liverpool always has been. And the slide shows here that striking character, Charles Riley, who headed the school for 30 years, who devised a sort of Beaux-Arts type curriculum which became the blueprint for architectural education in Britain. Now, the core of Riley's approach was the systematic studio-led teaching based on classical principles. Studio teaching took up more than half of the syllabus in the first year and increasingly more towards the end of the course, just as it does now. The teaching method, of course, was entirely different. Students were given their tasks and then they had 6 hours to produce their esquisse. And this esquisse was subject to formal criticism, and then they went away and drew up their final plans, all rendered in the French manner. The programs themselves became increasingly complex throughout the course, culminating in the competition for the RIBA's very own Rome Prize. The slide shows the winning entry of the Rome Prize in 1930, done by a Liverpool student called William Holford. Now, Holford, South African architect, later became a world-renowned city planner. Amongst many other things, he devised the post-war master plan for our campus here. Now, Riley School produced some of the leading British architects in the 20th century, and most buildings on our campus were designed by Liverpool graduates. Our own building, the Leverhulme building, was designed by Riley himself, together with his second-in-charge and successor, Lionel Budden. Harold Dodd, a Liverpool graduate, designed Harold Cohen Library. Maxwell Fry designed the Veterinary Science building. Who else have we got? Gordon Stevenson. Gordon Stevenson succeeded William Holford as the head of the civic design department of Liverpool, itself the first of its kind in the world. And after the Second World War, Gordon Stevenson built a new headquarters for the Civic Design Department, which is now the Stevenson Building here on Abercrombie Square, where some of you have your studios. Herbert Rouse, here on the left-hand side, one of the leading architects in the interwar period in Britain. He was one of the very earliest Liverpool graduates. He designed the India buildings, Martin's Bank on Water Street, and of course Philharmonic Hall. And James Stirling, perhaps the best, certainly the most creative architect of the 20th century in Britain, grew up and studied here in Liverpool as well, as did many others. Now, in the 2 decades between the end of the First World War and the beginning of the Second World War, the leading British schools more or less stuck to their variations of the Beaux-Arts system. Meanwhile, in Germany, a new school came into being, which in due course was to have the greatest of impact on architectural education worldwide. I've mentioned it before, but it's worth talking a little bit about it again. Of course, I'm talking about the Bauhaus. Now, as I mentioned a few weeks ago, Walter Gropius created the Bauhaus by merging 2 existing schools, one an art academy and the other one a School of Arts and Crafts. Gropius himself had studied at the Technical University of Berlin, but this was not the model he used for his Bauhaus. Instead, in those Gothic-obsessed expressionist times, he modeled his Bauhaus on a medieval building lodge. The name Bauhaus derives from Bauhütte, which is the German term for building lodge. Now, Gropius had the misguided belief that Gothic cathedrals had been the outcome of a collaborative effort of craftsmen without any direction through a self-conscious designer. Misguided because, as you heard in the first part of our lecture today, Gothic cathedrals were very much the creation of one man, even if certain tasks were delegated to independent or more or less independent craftsmen. Now, in Gropius' view, the building as a total work of art was the crowning achievement of artists and craftsmen working selflessly together. In other words, architecture would emerge organically from the collaboration of all building professionals. And this is why the Bauhaus did not have its own architecture department, and why Gropius did his best to prevent it from being created. You can see one of several workshops at the Bauhaus here, a ceramics workshop, and there a typical picture of Gropius with his piercing blue eyes and a sort of Herman Munster haircut. The course itself, the Bauhaus course, was divided into 3 stages. The first stage was the so-called forecourse, the preliminary course, 6 months, mandatory for all students, regardless of their specialization. It was, as I mentioned earlier, the creation of Johannes Itten, a Swiss painter, bit weird, who sort of installed a course which would help students unlearn their cultural cliches and sort of the innate creative force which he felt rested within each student. The second stage, indicated here by the two middle rings, lasted 3 years, and it was workshop instruction in crafts, which is pretty much what arts and crafts schools did and still do. Students were called apprentices and journeymen, and the 3-year course was taught by two separate masters. One was a craftsman, the so-called master of works, and the second one was an artist who was the master of form. Now, benevolently, one could argue that this setup reflected this dual nature, or this division of labor within a Gothic building lot, where work obviously was divided between the building director and the master of works. Less benevolently, one could argue that it merely reflected this dual nature of the Bauhaus, which was and remained an uneasy alliance between an art academy and an arts and crafts school. The third stage, at the center of this wheel, was the actual building, and that was the objective of the entire course. The combination of the various disciplines to create architecture as a total work of art. It is interesting to note that this idea, arts and crafts idea of architecture as a collaborative building effort was relatively short-lived in Britain itself, but it was taken up in other countries with great enthusiasm. Now, the Bauhaus did have precursors in Germany as well, but clearly Leatherby's School of Building at Brixton was one important model as well. Now, incidentally, the Bauhaus never or very rarely attained this ideal of the building, primarily because the economic situation in Germany didn't really allow for much building to be done. So there weren't any opportunities for students to actually build anything. Students were involved in decorating and detailing the Sommerfeld House, which I showed you in an earlier lecture, and they were also they participated in the interior design of the new Bauhaus buildings in Dessau, which I also showed you in the same lecture. Such more or less collaborative schemes, however, were rare, and those who were interested in architecture usually learned about it by sort of hanging around in Gropius's private office and helping with plan drawings and model building, etc. So, in a sense, an informal form of pupillage. Now, in its basic setup, the Bauhaus did not change much over the 15 years it existed, but there were important modifications. One concerned this preliminary course. The esoteric Itten resigned in 1922, and 1 year later, Josef Albers and Laszlo Moholy-Nagy took over the direction of the course, and they had completely different ideas. They had no great interest in sort of free associative material studies, such as you can see on the left-hand side under Itten, and instead they urged the students to do sort of pseudo-scientific investigations into kinetics, balance, transparency, stuff like that, very typical. The workshops themselves shifted from a sort of crafts approach to preoccupation with industrial manufacturing. So arts and craftsy decorations, such as the ones over there at the Sommerfeld House, they fell out of favor, and they gave way to this typical cool sort of machine aesthetic with which the Bauhaus is usually associated today. The second important change concerned the foundation of an architecture department in 1927 under Hannes Meyer. Meyer's department came to dominate the Bauhaus, and 1 year after he arrived, he took over the direction of the Bauhaus as a whole from Gropius. Mayer introduced a number of scientific courses, but in and by themselves, they were not really a new idea. What it meant was that Mayer essentially joined the Bauhaus model with the German Polytechnic model. In other words, he made the Bauhaus a little bit more of an architecture school and a little bit less of an arts and crafts school. The idea of group working persisted much the same as before. Architecture education took mostly place in Mayer's private office, and he involved his students in his professional schemes, perhaps to an even greater extent than Gropius had done. Mayer's famous social housing scheme, perhaps his most famous building in Dessau-Turten, was developed in close collaboration with large groups of his students. Now, as you probably know, the Bauhaus didn't actually produce many notable architects. Marcel Breuer, whose chair we just saw here on the right-hand side, he was pretty much the only one. But what the Bauhaus did do was give important impulses to architectural education. One of them was the idea of this liberating preliminary course, which in some way is, if you studied here in Britain, is what you did in your first year, a sort of investigation into forms, spaces, simple designs, which ease you into being architects, or more importantly, into thinking like architects. The key point here is that the Bauhaus, unlike any other school system, or unlike any other educational system at the time, started on the assumption that the past had nothing to teach students, and that each problem had to be analyzed and developed from within. And this is essentially still how architecture is taught today. Another important Bauhaus legacy is this idea of group working. Not in the Beaux-Arts sense of someone doing a design and then the others basically serving as his team of assistants, but really as a way to develop a design idea in collaboration. Now, this is not really how architecture works in real life, but it is an incredibly useful teaching tool because it teaches you as students not only to clarify your design ideas, but to verbalize them and to put them out there and convince your fellow students of your ideas. And this is one of the key skills you absolutely have to have as architects. Here in Liverpool, we're particularly sold on this idea of group working. Many other schools do not allow group theses in your final year, but we do, and they are often amongst the best ones we get. Now, it's uncertain how much direct influence the Bauhaus had on British architectural education in the 1930s. My current research centers exactly on this question. What is clear is that modernism found expression in student works before it was actually built at the large scale in Britain. Usually, these were basically, or at least at the beginning, these were basically Beaux-Arts schemes dressed up in a modernist look. This happened simultaneously at various schools, but nowhere quite as conspicuously as at Liverpool and at the AA. These projects here are fairly typical examples. So you can see basically a sort of reduced modernist language, but superimposed on a strictly symmetrical, classically layouted scheme. Miss Trent up there at the AA did pretty much the same. Her fellow student, slightly different, but again, extremely reduced sort of modernist language, almost looks like an Aldo Rossi building, but arranged in a sort of casual manner, very unlike a typical Beaux-Arts scheme, but then again, rendered in a sort of French Beaux-Arts manner. This would be in color. The Beaux-Arts plans I showed you earlier, they would also be in color. So you just have to take my word for this. So there are some mixtures of modernist influences coming into what was still effectively a Beaux-Arts system, watered-down Beaux-Arts system. Now, Charles Riley, the head of the school, never a person with strong architectural convictions, he allowed this modernist look at Liverpool. And the AA was at the time headed by a man called Howard Robertson, who had himself studied at the Beaux-Arts school in Paris, and who remained convinced of the fundamental rightness of the Beaux-Arts approach, but on the other hand also felt that theoretically the Beaux-Arts system could accommodate any style as long as the basic compositional principles were adhered to. So obviously to Riley and to Robertson, modernism was just another style. For many students, it was rather more than that, but at least at Liverpool and at the AA, they were allowed to experiment with this new modernist language. At the time when the architectural establishment in this country was still vehemently opposed to anything modern. You remember I mentioned Reginald Blomfield in one of my earlier lectures, who sort of fought his battle against modernismus as a German communist conspiracy which had to be fought at all costs. The first step towards a truly modern architectural education happened in 1936 when the AA appointed a new head of the school, a man called E.A.A. Rouse. Now, we don't know an awful lot about Rouse, apart from the fact that he was primarily a planner rather than an architect, and he had an extreme interest in sociological research. Basically, his approach to architecture was scientific rather than artistic, and he strongly encouraged his students to form themselves into group and work collaboratively on their designs and engage in extensive research. Now, in the Beaux-Arts system, students were given a very limited time frame to produce the basic concept of their scheme, and then they were tied to that basic concept, the irrevocable esquisse, as it was called. In Rouse's AA, there was no such thing. Instead, students spent enormous amounts of time into their inquiries and research of all sorts. More importantly even than their design solution, sometimes they didn't even produce a design solution, but just did the research. This obviously wasn't exactly what the RIBA wanted from architecture schools, so the RIBA threatened to withdraw its recognition of the AA if they didn't fall in line, which they didn't. The slide shows the work of a group of fourth-year students who spent most of the term doing a sort of investigation into one particular area of London, interviewing residents and analyzing their housing conditions as the basis for their design. I don't really know if they actually did a design, but they put a lot of effort into their research, and that's what the AA was like at the time. AA students, traditionally a rather vocal group of people at the time, welcomed the changes to the school curriculum that happened under Rouse, but they felt that these changes did not go nearly far enough. In June 1937, they issued this report of Students' Subcommittee on the School System, generally known as the Yellow Book, for obvious reasons. The students proudly proclaimed their Yellow Book as the first tentative step to clarify the basis on which a modern school should rest. And at least in this country, that was pretty much what they did. Now, the students rejected this arts and crafts idea of architecture as being a sort of artistic vocational discipline, and they urged the school to raise their entry standards to sort of lift the intellectual level of the AA school. At the core of their manifesto, however, was their total opposition to the Beaux-Arts system. Frankly, much of their argument was a little bit flawed because their understanding of the Beaux-Arts system was rather limited. But what they did understand was that the Beaux-Arts system was very competitive and that they didn't want anything to do with it. They didn't want any eskies, they didn't want any formal juries, they didn't want any marking, and they certainly didn't have the slightest interest in the Rome Prize. The slide here, if it then comes, shows the one student project which really epitomized this modernist awakening at the AA in the late 1930s. This is a town planning scheme produced by a total of 17 students over a 2-year period. There are the obvious modernist features. You can see it on the top and the middle pictures. There's this sort of combination of 3-story terraces with slabs all set in a sort of parkland setting. This is pretty much, looks very similar to some housing schemes Gropius had built in Berlin in the early 1930s. What's remarkable is also the presentation technique with these die-line, black and white, very clear, very precise, similar to the competition entry which I showed you of Hannes Meyer in an earlier lecture. It's really quintessentially modernist and totally different to the sort of rendering that was done at the Beaux-Arts School or under the Beaux-Arts system at British schools. In presentation and style, this was as modernist as it got, but more important was this change in emphasis from aesthetic to social considerations. This was not a cathedral or a public monument. Instead, it was a social housing project, seen in a broader planning context and developed in collaboration between the students and in collaboration also with experts such as economists, planners, sociologists, public authority officials. So they looked up all these people, interviewed them, and sort of developed this as a template for the way a modern city should be built. You can see this typical division of the housing blocks from industry and these huge parkland settings, obviously very much this Siam idea with the zoning of different functions. Now, the Second World War put an end to such educational experiments, but when the war ended, it was again the AA which first faced up to the new realities. In the late 1940s and throughout the 1950s, the AA emerged as the leading school of architecture in Britain, almost without competition. There are many reasons for this, the most important of which is perhaps the fact that being an independent school, the AA was able to react to this fast-changing, fluid, sort of unsettled conditions of the post-war period much quicker and much more effectively than any other institution. The AA pioneered a number of unique educational schemes at the time. Immediately after the war, it set up a practical training site on Morwell Street, just behind the AA, to give students, obviously modeled on the School of Building at Brixton, and intended to give students in the post-war years the opportunity to learn some building skills at a time when building production in the country was at an all-time low. So there weren't actually any building sites where they could have learned anything about it, so the AA set up its own. In the late 1940s, it also introduced a sort of Bauhaus-type four-course, preliminary course, including the production of workshop objects and this sort of patchwork combination of materials and forms, and also this sort of constructivist compositional schemes, which was very much like the things Albers did at the Bauhaus. The AA also introduced group working throughout the entire course, and it allowed its students liberties in far-reaching liberties in the way they interpreted their curriculum, and if they had a good reason, they could basically do whatever they liked. For the more enterprising students, this really was a revelation. And as a result, the AA not only managed to produce an incredibly large number of leading architects of the past 50 years, including many of those we met last week in Ewan Harrison's lecture, CZWG, Outram, Rogers. They all studied at the AA at the time. Their student work often anticipated future trends, and brutalism, for instance, was one of many architectural ideas which were sort of floated in AA student work before it was actually built in this country. This project here, fourth year housing scheme for Paddington, is perhaps the most striking example of this. An exceedingly interesting scheme was the AA's Department of Tropical Architecture, which was inaugurated in 1954. Like Liverpool, the AA had always had a large number of foreign students, with many British colonies and dominions on the verge of independence. And there was a strong sense amongst the more progressive British architects that in architecture too, this British or generally European dominance was on its way out, or should at least be on its way out. The goal of the Department of Tropical Architecture was to provide its students, almost all of them postgraduates from Africa and Asia, with a body of knowledge and skills which they could apply to the specific climatic conditions in their home countries. The emphasis was therefore on investigations into appropriate planning solutions and building technologies for tropical climates, including an examination of local vernaculars. So pretty much what Charles Correa would be doing from the mid-1960s onward, but this was in the mid-1950s, so really at least a decade ahead of its time. Now, the RIBA welcomed some such novelties and dismissed many others. On the whole, it couldn't really do much about them other than expressing their disapproval. The RIBA was at the time in a sort of paralyzed state, torn between warring factions. On the one hand, those who hoped to reinstate the Beaux-Arts training methods of earlier decades, and on the other hand, a group of modernizers who felt that all this was hopeless nonsense, and what was needed was an entirely new modern approach to education. In the mid-1950s, the modernizers managed to take control of the RIBA's Board of Architectural Education. They comprised two different sets of people. One group of people were modernist heads of schools, which hoped to change the system from within. The most important of these was Michael Patrick, the principal of the AA, and his key allies was Douglas Jones at Birmingham and Gardner Medwin, who was in the process of setting up a sort of polytechnical model at Liverpool with a strong emphasis on building technologies and public health solutions and sociological research, etc. The second group of modernizers were architects who worked in high positions in the public sector. They envisaged architecture as a public service similar to the NHS, and they called for an educational system which would prepare architects for an extended role. They thought architects in the future would be strategists, they would be policymakers, rather than mere designers, and they felt that architectural education had to provide solutions for this extended role. Now, by the mid-1950s, the modernizers had acquired sufficient power on the RIBA to push through a conference on architectural education at which the pattern of future education would be settled once and for all. At the time, it is important to remember, it was still possible to become an architect through articled pupillage and through passing the RIBA's exam. entry into architecture schools was very, very easy in an intellectual sense. All you needed was 3 O levels. So the academic standards of architectural schools was very poor. And this, the modernizers felt, had to change. So this was the situation when in 1958 the RIBA called this Conference on Architectural Education at Oxford. The chairman of the conference was this man on the left there, Leslie Martin, a very, very powerful figure in British post-war architecture. Ewan Harrison mentioned him last week. Martin was the former chief architect to the London County Council, and he had just taken over as head at Cambridge. The conference itself was carefully limited to 50 hand-picked participants, all of them, or the vast majority of them, representing the sort of modernist, progressive wing of the profession. It agreed 6 momentous decisions, all of which were subsequently implemented. 1, entry to architecture schools should be raised to a minimum of 2 A levels. 2, courses based on RIBA examinations were to be abolished, which meant that pupillage was to be abolished. 3, recognized schools had to be in universities or similar institutions. 4, courses had to be either full-time or sandwich. I'll come back to that. And 5, other forms of training not leading to an architectural qualification should be devised. So in other words, those who weren't clever enough to meet the 2 A levels, there should be a separate course of education, keeping them within the building environment, but not as architects. They were called technologists at the time. And 6, postgraduate work and or research was to be seen as essential and was to be expanded. Now, in the 1960s and 1970s, all schools of architecture aligned themselves with this system or were forced to close down, the AA being an independent school, the only exception. And if you look at these 6 resolutions in detail, you will realize that this is effectively the system under which you are training at the moment. Now, from a historian's point of view, it's interesting to note that this system, which we have today, is effectively a combination of features drawn from the 3 main educational systems which had emerged by the end of the 19th century. Obviously, little is left of the Beaux-Arts system in aesthetic and stylistic terms, yet studio tuition was as central to the Beaux-Arts model as it is to our model today. And the Oxford Conference on Architectural Education established the RIBA as an incredibly powerful organization dominating or guiding architectural education to an extent almost like the Beaux-Arts Academy had done. So what we have is in effect a modern reincarnation of the French academic system. The Oxford Conference also determined that architecture had to be taught at a university, and that the teaching of architecture, just like the teaching of any other university subject, had to be coupled with research. All academic staff at British schools of architecture are expected to engage in some sort of research, and to some extent so are you, starting with coursework essays such as the ones that you will hopefully submit by tomorrow, but getting increasingly more towards the end of your course. If you do an MArch, you'll end up writing a proper piece of research up to 10,000 words. This, of course, is all the legacy of the German Polytechnic model. Finally, pupillage was abolished in the wake of the Oxford Conference, yet it does live on in this peculiar sandwich setup, which we have at British Schools of Architecture, where you have to interrupt your course halfway through and then at the end again to gain practical experience, at least 2 years, otherwise you won't be allowed to qualify. It also lives on in this specifically British tradition of hiring practicing architects in a part-time capacity to become your studio tutors. These, if you will, are the genuinely British components of your training. So these then are the roots of your education. Naturally, there have been some amendments and alterations over the past decade, but on the whole, the system has changed remarkably little, considering how much the world as a whole, including the building industry, has changed over the past 60 years. It really serves as a reminder that reform in architectural education is a very, very drawn-out process. Change is in the air, I must say, but change has been in the air for quite a while, so don't hold your breath. And with this, I would like to conclude today's lecture and this term's lecture course. Thank you very much for your attention and attendance. I wish you the very best of luck with both your coursework essay and with your exams, and I'm sure we will cross paths again in future years.